In our previous episode, we examined reports from various individuals who stated that there is a secret facility buried deep beneath the New Mexico town of Dulce. But we deliberately avoided the testimony of one man, who is arguably the most controversial figure in the allegations surrounding the possible existence of Dulce Base, a man who claimed he was the survivor of a war beneath the mesa. Having sought shelter behind an equipment crate of sufficient size, the lieutenant now tried to take stock of the situation. At least 3 members of his platoon were gone, their bodies charred beyond all recognition following exposure to the horrific weaponry employed by their opponents. Despite this, they had managed to push the enemy force deeper into the facility, as they had been ordered to do so, and if they could just secure the stairwell in front of them, the mission would be a success. Waving across the corridor, where 2 more of his team members were sheltering behind another crate, he began to issue a series of orders using hand signals. Moments later, the pair were up on their feet and heading towards the looming metal door, each tightly clutching a satchel charge. Their intention was clear. But before they could reach their objective, the door suddenly sprung wide open. A skeletal figure materialized from the darkness within, followed by a terrifying bright blue energy discharge from its weapon. The 2 soldiers did not even have time to cry out, as their bodies were engulfed in a ball of brilliant blue flame. Almost immediately, an infantryman further down the corridor, operating the platoon's M60 heavy machine gun, opened fire, shredding the attacker with a steady hail of gunfire. More soldiers then ran forwards, snatching up the discarded satchel charges and priming them, before hurling them in through the open doorway. There was an enormous explosion, immediately followed by a shower of dust and debris as the stairwell caved in, preventing their enemy from accessing this floor or any others which lay above them. Leaving 2 of his men to cover the collapsed structure, the lieutenant and the remainder of his platoon made their way back up through the facility towards the main loading area. But upon his arrival, he was shocked to see that 2 further army trucks had arrived, discharging several more squads of soldiers wearing black uniforms, who hurried towards the corridors from which he and his men had just emerged. Turning to his commanding officer, he abruptly inquired as to what was taking place, who this unit were, and why they were now heading underground towards the lower levels. Curtly dismissed, he and his fellow Navy SEALs could only watch on as the mysterious soldiers continued to head deeper into the base, where so many US soldiers had already lost their lives in an effort to contain the marauding, extraterrestrial threat. During the summer of 1995, Phil Schneider gave a series of lectures across the United States, in which he went to great pains to highlight to his audience the dangers of what he was doing. He spoke of the murder of his close friend, which he alleged had been made to look like a suicide. Then he related various attempts on his own life and threats to harm his family in an effort to stop him from sharing confidential military secrets with the public. But Schneider explained that his love for his country superseded any thoughts for his personal safety, that the American people had a right to know the potential dangers which their government was hiding from them. He would open his talks by explaining how he came from a family of public servants, how his father had been a military officer who worked on the Manhattan Project. Then he would reveal to those present the fingers missing from his left hand, relating how he had lost them whilst fighting to regain control of a secret military installation from extraterrestrial attackers, Schneider would hold up bizarre-looking metals and minerals, claiming that they were products of experiments which had been kept hidden from the American people. He would then explain in great detail how there was a vast network of underground military bases beneath the surface of North America, linked together by miles and miles of magnetic train tracks. Finally, he would close his lectures by saying that when his time came, just like his friend, his murder would be made to look like a suicide, reiterating that he had no wish to end his own life. Less than a year later, the impassioned public speaker would indeed be found dead in his apartment. His death, perhaps unsurprisingly to anybody who had ever heard him speak, ultimately being ruled as suicide. Much as the former Air Force Sergeant Thomas Costello had done before him, Phil Schneider told anyone who would give him the time that there was a military base hidden deep beneath the Archuleta Mesa. But unlike the enigmatic Costello, Schneider chose to deliver his evidence in a far more public manner, speaking openly to roomfuls of interested people and fielding any questions they might have concerning his account. He described how, since the end of the Second World War, the United States government had been building a vast network of underground bases around the country. Schneider explained that to his knowledge, there were 129 deep underground military bases, or DUMBs, hidden beneath the plains, mesas, and mountain ranges of North America. 9 of these were clustered in close proximity to one another, located in and around Groom Lake, near the infamous Area 51 testing facility in Nevada. All of these bases were linked by a seemingly endless series of tunnels, which housed a maglev train line, allowing workers to travel between the locations at speeds of up to Mach 2. As he stood and summarized how these tunnels had been created and how each of the secret bases had been constructed, audiences found themselves visibly impressed by the level of technical detail Schneider used. Having listed his credentials as a geologist and structural engineer, he related how he had been brought onto the project to assist with the complicated and advanced construction methods being used. The maglev tunnels had not been drilled or blasted through the ground, but had instead been created using laser technology that vitrified and melted its way through the previously impenetrable rock. In order to create each base, 4 gaping holes were bored deep into the earth. Each separate floor was then blasted out of the rock before being linked up to these 4 gigantic corner shafts. And it was amidst the construction of one facility in New Mexico during the late 1970s that Phil Schneider became an unwitting participant in what would become known as the Dulce War. Schneider maintained that in August of 1979, construction on the Dulce base had begun to fall behind schedule due to issues relating to the drilling of one of the corner columns. The facility was being tunneled out beneath the southwest corner of the Archuleta Mesa, but every time the drilling team had attempted to pass a certain depth, they found that their machinery was mysteriously failing. In an effort to discover what was frustrating the drilling operation, Schneider and a Green Beret bodyguard had been lowered into the incomplete shaft via a crane. But as soon as he stepped out of the crane basket into what appeared to be a pre-existing cave network, he had instantly realized that something was very wrong. There was a bitter and unnatural stench in the air, as the drilling operation had now allowed ancient gases to escape from the void beneath, along with a mysterious and sooty residue on the unusually smooth walls of the caves. It was at this point that a tall and slender grey figure had suddenly stepped out of the shadows in front of him, carrying what appeared to be a weapon of some description. Utterly terrified by this creature's unearthly and intimidating appearance, Schneider had used his sidearm to kill it, only for two more to then emerge out of the darkness behind. Backing towards the crane basket and firing wildly, the engineer had managed to fell one of the pair, only for the other to then use its own weapon upon him in retaliation. Schneider was instantly consumed by an eerie blue light and felt a huge jolt of electricity burst through his body, which had sent him crashing to the cave floor. When he came to, he found himself being bundled into the crane basket by the Green Beret, who then turned and engaged more of the creatures as the basket began to ascend without him. Upon his return to the surface, the doctors who treated Schneider found severe damage to both his left hand and foot, with several fingers and toes missing. After he had explained to his superiors what had taken place, he was removed from the project, but later discovered that construction had continued despite his encounter. For the next year, it was alleged that further battles beneath the mesa ensued as US Special Forces clashed with alien interlopers, who appeared intent on frustrating the construction of the base. Schneider claims that in total, 66 soldiers and countless extraterrestrials lost their lives before an uneasy peace was finally formed between the two opposing sides. He went on to allege that the aliens who had been residing beneath the mesa had worked with humans ever since, creating numerous scientific breakthroughs which had gone on to assist mankind. Throughout 1995, Schneider continued to tour the United States, giving talks in which he listed numerous other alleged conspiracies alongside the revelations of deep underground military bases. Over the course of these lectures, however, it soon became apparent that the former engineer was beginning to struggle with what he had started. He described how he had been involved in a shootout with federal agents, killing one in self-defense, and how an attempt had been made to kidnap his daughter in a bid to force him to stop delivering his lectures. Then, in January of 1996, 2 months after his final speech in Denver, federal agents arrived at the home of Schneider's ex-wife, Cynthia. They explained how Phil had been found dead in his apartment in Wilsonville, having apparently decided to take his own life. The agents went on to conduct a search of Cynthia's house, removing any notes or materials relating to Phil and his lectures, before then leaving. The circumstances surrounding Schneider's death have always raised questions about the speed with which the authorities moved to attribute it to suicide. Phil's body had been found slumped between his bed and wheelchair, with a rubber catheter hose having been wrapped around his neck 3 times and tied off with a knot. Both his feet were wedged hard underneath the bed, with his head resting in the seat of the wheelchair at an angle that would not appear to have been easy or natural for him to achieve. There were traces of blood on the floor nearby, but no injuries or wounds were found on the body itself to suggest where this may have come from. When the family later asked if a suicide note had been discovered, they were told that all the papers seized from the address had now inexplicably gone missing from a police storage facility. Subsequent requests for additional toxicology testing on Schneider's remains were refused on the grounds of adverse cost, considering the cause of death had already been determined. Further and more adamant demands for these tests would also be refused, because the samples had apparently been destroyed by the laboratory which had been storing them. One detective who later spoke privately with the family stated that with the missing fingers on Schneider's left hand, it would have been almost impossible for him to have tied off the catheter himself. When the officer in question had shared these concerns with his superiors, he had been ordered to keep his observations to himself, before then being reassigned to a different case. It appeared that even in death, Phil Schneider was continuing to raise awkward and uneasy questions for those in positions of authority. When taken in context of the many accounts which already exist regarding a possible underground base at Dulce, the testimony of Phil Schneider appears to be compelling. Many of the experimental compounds and construction techniques he listed during the course of his lectures were mere concepts during the late 20th century, but have gone on to become commonplace in modern building work. His descriptions of the base layout and the functions of each of the 7 levels were also eerily similar to those offered by other witnesses, people whom he'd never met or associated with. And yet, even the lightest touch of scrutiny has shown his accounts to be marred by falsehoods and inaccuracies, which make it difficult to take some of his claims seriously. He made repeated assertions that his father, Otto Oskar Schneider, was a German U-boat captain who had been captured by the US Navy and then turned against the Nazi regime. Yet a cursory search of both German and American wartime records shows this to be an apparent fabrication, with Otto having been born in San Francisco in January of 1906. Similarly, his claims that the original attack on the World Trade Center involved the use of a tactical nuclear weapon and that the occupants of Waco Ranch had been murdered using chemical weapons have apparently been debunked. These revelations would appear to suggest that Phil Schneider was an individual prone to exaggeration, sometimes verging on the edge of delusion. But if this was the case, then where did he sustain his life-changing injuries? And what happened to the missing samples and notes he had brought with him to his lectures? Why is there so much evidence that he was silenced by unknown persons, and efforts made to present his murder as a suicide? Schneider's detractors argue that he was not a well man and merely seized upon the alleged testimony of Thomas Costello, using it to conjure up a fantastical backstory of his own. But to his supporters, the inconsistencies in his account are explained away as the US government rewriting his family history, designed specifically to undermine Schneider's credibility and keep prying eyes away from the Dulce base. They point to the same methods used against Bob Lazar and his removal from college and employment records as an example of the lengths the US government will go to cover up such revelations. With the advent of the internet, each passing year sees more information on classified military projects slowly creeping into the public domain. It is therefore entirely possible that at some future point, evidence proving the existence of deep underground military bases will finally materialize. Or it may be that advances in technology enable investigators to finally disprove the existence of such facilities once and for all. For now at least, it seems there is a lot more digging to be done.